Hello. This is what I would look like with bangs, which I do not have. It's just how my hair fell when I put my glasses down. So yeah, I did not get bangs. Do not worry. But it would be kind of cute in an alternate life. That coffee's so bitter. Okay, I put like 10 scoops of coffee, and that was not a good idea. Anyway, welcome to Vivas, and we're gonna get started because this is technically the last Viva that I will ever do. I have one more because I got behind a week, but anyway, next week we'll talk about the how the hippie movement turned violent in 1968. But for this week, we're going to talk about and answer the question, in what ways did the conservative revolution of the 1980s play out? So, although we really tend to focus on the revolutionary changes that happened in the 60s and 70s, the following decade brought America back to normalcy and back to a conservative, like, revolution, I guess. And following the upheaval of the 60s and 70s, 70s and 60s, the 80s reestablished conservatism as a movement, and kind of a bunch of different conservative ideas or ideals into one broad movement. So the three ways that we're going to look at how the conservative revolution play out, we're going to look at it politically, obviously, always, culturally, and then relationally. I have a hard time saying conservatism, so bear with me. Our first thing we're going to talk about is politics, of course, and we really need to look at the context of the 80s. This is at the end of the Cold War. America has stepped back from Vietnam, and America as a whole is a lot less worried about the threat of nuclear war. There's still that threat, but it's less imminent, and USSR is preoccupied in Afghanistan, and so America shifts its focus kind of inward. And gone is the mid-century centrism, which is when there was a lot more balance in the political system and a lot less hyper, super conservative or super liberal. Conservative would be the right, left is liberal. Well, anyway, there was a lot more balance in the system in the decades following the war, because obviously people needed to be unified during the Cold War and following World War II in America, so they were more focused on trying to, both parties come together. And when all of this tension subsides with the USSR, America finally kind of becomes more polarized in its political climate. So all this going on, and Michael Barron says that the bipartisan agreement on foreign policy that prevailed for two post-war decades ended as doves came to dominate the Democratic Party and Will Hawks the Republican. Michael Barron goes on to talk about how abortion became a really preeminent issue that polarized people, and pro-lifers abandoned the Democrat and pro-choicers the Republican. So we see this separation in the parties, which is our context today, obviously. And it all kind of comes from the conservative revolution in the 80s. Jimmy Carter, he was president. Duh. And we need to talk about him and the Iran hostage crisis because it will help lay the scene for Ronald Reagan coming. So some call Jimmy Carter a president that didn't have like a strong hold on his leadership. We can see this in the Iran hostage crisis. Basically, there was a more liberal leader in Iran. His name is Shah Mohammed. I'm missing one name that starts with an R. Pahlavi, and he was a royal family member in Iran. He's the leader, and basically, this other conservative leader named Shah takes over in Iran, and Jimmy Carter doesn't really step in at this point. He doesn't move to support Shah, the more liberal leader in Iran that was like taken down from power. And he also doesn't try to talk things out with the new leader. The new leader, Khamenei, which I did not mention his name, but he's the new leader. Anyway, Jimmy Carter basically provides like medical help to Shah, and this makes a lot of people have anti-Americans, like they're mad at America for this in Iran, and so a bunch of students go to the embassy, the US embassy in Iran. They take people hostages, and a hostage crisis lasts for like 444 days that Carter can't figure out. So this is also happening during election time. Carter against Reagan, and people see how little hold Carter has on the situation, and this leads to the landslide victory of Reagan. So Reagan obviously, oh yeah, and Iran as a whole shows us the step towards conservatism in the difference we see, the stark contrast we see in like pictures of Iran and Iranian people in the 70s compared to now. It was a lot more Western, a lot less conservative until the 80s, which everything kind of shifted in leadership in Iran and stuff. So yeah, that is Jimmy Carter, and Reagan comes in, very conservative, blah blah blah. William F. Buckley Jr. Conservative, I don't know what to call him. He's like a big part of the conservative movement in the 80s. And he says this quote that really shows us the new conservative revolution in the 80s. He says, "I mean to live my life an obedient man, but obedient to God, subservient to the wisdom of my ancestors, never to the authority of political truths arrived yesterday at the voting booth." Buckley's basically saying that there is absolute truth that we find in God. We have to be obedient to that truth. And he kind of, in the end of that quote, goes against the democratic system and says that he will never like be obedient or subservient to political truths arrived yesterday at the voting booth. That's William F. Buckley Jr., founder of like the National Review, and what he does most for the conservative movement is probably the founding of the Buckley Coalition, which is very interesting given today's context. Usually when you think of a conservative, what comes to mind is someone who is socially conservative and like governmentally, not governmentally, but like want free market capitalism. You could be libertarian. You're going to be in support of American military action. A lot of evangelical or Catholics, probably pro-life. All these things are part of the conservative identity. Buckley is the one who kind of umbrellas all these different like groups into one coalition. And Ramesh Ponnuru says that when Buckley started the National Review, it wasn't at all obvious that anti-communist, traditionalist, constitutionalist, and enthusiasts for free markets would all be able to take shelter under the same tent. It's kind of crazy that in the 80s, how like conservatives today, their identity was kind of formed in the 80s. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but that is Buckley. And next we're going to talk a little bit about Thatcher, was the prime minister in England, in the UK, I should say. And her political leaning was obviously conservative, and she, in Thatcherism as it's called, she advocates for things such as greater independence of individuals from the state, restrictions on trade unions. She wants to reduce the expenditures for social services like education and housing and healthcare. That's Thatcher. And lastly, neoconservatives. So a lot of Democrats or members of the American Communist Party become really disenfranchised with their party and with the foreign policies and domestic policies. So they form neoconservatives. That is how we see the conservative revolution playing out in politics through people like William F. Buckley Jr. and Reagan and Thatcher in the neoconservative movement. So next we're going to talk about culturally how we see these changes, in what ways. And we're going to look at minimalism in both music and in architecture a little bit. So if you live today, you know what minimalism is, so I'm not going to describe it to you, but this starts in the 80s, kind of, this rebirth of minimalism, because it comes in waves, in a lot of ways. Is that my new jeans? No! I got new jeans, they're really cute. Can't really see them, but it's okay. Anyway, coffee spilled on them. Oh well. So yeah, where was I? Oh, minimalism in music. There is an avant-garde music movement in the 80s. We can kind of see this in Philip Glass in Glassworks. This movement that focuses on repetition in short phrases of music. So like repeating short phrases, or like, I don't know what the word is for them, in music, and layering those kind of create a hypnotic vibe in the music. That is minimalism in music, not using a lot of complicated phrases, but rather short ones. It's Alan Bloom. Gotta talk a little about this guy who was a big advocate for closing the American mind, which is the title of his book that was an accidental bestseller. And Alan Bloom sees openness in moral relativism as really dangerous and as undermining critical thinking, and he just sees this openness of people as dangerous. And so John Levinson says about Alan in his book that Bloom claims that people lack any conception of truth and were thus unreleased in a deep, self-destructive cultural relativism that was destroying the possibility of a credible education. Basically, Bloom wants to close the American mind and make truths absolute because he saw it as dangerous to have openness in mind, how it caused danger. So this is summed up in the quote by Allen Bloom, who says, "A true political or social order requires the soul to be like a Gothic cathedral, with selfish stress and strains helping to hold it up. Abstract moralism condemns certain keystones, removes them, and then blames both the nature of the stones and the structures when it collapses." That's Allen Bloom, a little bit cultural. And now we're going to go on to relationally. This may be my shortest viva ever if I can whip through this last point. So, how conservative revolution impacts relationships, how people relate to each other. We're going to look at the yuppies and the AIDS crisis. So, yuppies are the young, urban, upward moving professionals. And this is a movement in the 80s in which a lot of people are going into the finance business and stuff. And they are all trying to get ahead in life, get a bunch of money, get rich. And in places like Wall Street, there's a bunch of people fresh out of college, right out of business school, like Harvard Business School, going to Wall Street and trying to earn they're starting at a 6-figure salary as entry level in the finance business. And they work really long days, but they have a lot of money. So that is the yuppies. And they have a big emphasis on success and trying to just make it in the finance business and I guess other businesses too. But that's the yuppies. And this is a move away from the 60s and 70s, this idea of the individual going out to find yourself, reacting against society, and we see young people going back into the folds of society, I guess, and wanting to embrace their wealth and all this stuff that the hippies are no way, man, just give us some LSD and leave us alone in the woods. Yuppies are not like that. Maybe cocaine, but they want the riches and the wealth of the life. Trump is a part of this yuppie thing going on in the 80s. And he's obviously conservative, no doubt. But we don't have to talk about him. And the last thing I want to cover really quickly is this move towards gay marriage. Not move towards, but people wanting to legalize gay marriage and the AIDS crisis in the 80s. So AIDS crisis happens in the 80s. People start to want to legalize gay marriage, and the argument is that gay marriage itself is a move towards conservatism because it's people saying that all people should have marriage rights, but it's also arguing against this free love culture of the 70s and trying to bring in normalcy or cultural, I don't know what the word is, but making it making gay marriage more socially normal. And this could be argued that it's a move towards conservatism. So anyways, 80s, great time to be alive. Kind of, I don't know, wasn't there, don't really care. But anyways, the 80s was a move back towards conservatism. Conservatism. There's some words, I swear to God. Strategic and conservatism. I just can't say them. So pardon me for that mistake. I will try to work on speaking better, more articulately. Anyway, guys, have a great week. We saw the conservative revolution play out in the 80s. We saw it play out politically, culturally, and relationally. I'm gonna go make a carrot cake. And yeah, just enjoy my life. So you do the same. Toodles. Bye.